ngato talala chonso ya kong ngato te dendri shune ko te tate te chiware tikola deshi jaya ta socha loji to so deshi jaya resha kone nda omani in pache ni ton deni ni ton chyo palati gris ki jaga jong sa che te jin tene de nyang ja chu la lo ma bo chen ro mi to to so chong ko so so yomba ta nyang ja chu kundu e marti jaga ki nyang ja chu ke jong sa that there nanging ki to so to chise ko leka ma bo chen tene la ba de nga so loji te 인지나는 도 야이나라 모트는 도서 때는 콩때 자가 때 이면 대화요 봐 자가 이면 아프가니스탄이나 파키스탄이나 방글라데시나 나가이나 도서 내가 녀다 만보 나올 차토 나올 쉬우니와 대 나지 대 자치는 녀다 만보 나올 냥슈체 맞는 게임 거야 대중코 가르에서 치스 내가 로니시아 순시아 스타가트 레호 나올 이게 야마테 든 제득이나 콜로니 순시아라 그 든들 멤버 치식 내가 제가 맞지 도서 놓는 거는 개인커 맞지 타치 도서 제이면 강 상로 때 도서 제니 오늘 간에 할래와 든 로드기 든들지 레샤 든들 미치 가서 티 지테 대화 중앙에 땅 수진 양식거나 가서 다 가려서 지 레홍 오토니 대화 마부 중앙 때 덴드 쉬어 콜케자 셰도 도서 로지 통하는 가서 참에 그때 배드 할래와 가고 간에 수진 양식거니 가고 간데 놀리지와이 지다 가서 때 양식콩 세도 배든 자주 소가 말아 대죠 가서 자주 체크 있는라 자주 마치 있는 거 상춘다마다 여는 가서 한번 딘딘슈 상스 제린 지야래 동지 콩때 대대네 덴드 대지 요리 뜨고 모주 지야서 가서 때 텐셜 레홍을 깨져 주와이 야분도 송도 때 대죠 참에 통화를 듣는 게 가르쳐야잖아 그런 게 대대 가르쳐 다다 자카 첨부 또친 자카 펜스 바그 나라 베데 수바티 꼴 여다 게임스는 도탕탕 투선난 베 수바티 가르쳐서 다 텔 광게 능야가 이자 있는다 자종 있는다 시자 있는다 또 참아 냐뇨 있는다 참아 된대와 든듯이 다 바다 가서 든듯이 토한테 가서 개첨부 쉬지 통되어 가서 대민공시는 하바트 도서 둘 중앙 여봐 소소 난그 된다 춘춘해 봐 된다 때서 최상 자진 내당 간르시 자진 내당 나는 가서 배 가wan 로금도 딘 로야 너는 가서 당카 가르치는 시당 가르치 도서 둘 상라 당사 둘 레자 당 상라 당당 그때서 양보용아 도서 둘 가서 양시 빠인으로 타마 요말라 펜바 쉬지 통성 대중 가서 다리 콩 덴덴 쉬어 덴데 가서 송시 고지치야테 개체 된체 쓰네 덴데 정화인 덴데 제도 대자를 가서 조화 정리 두세 요래더니 소미 조화 정리 당 도서 낭토나 낭사 달 해와래 그 가르레스는 오늘 전에 그때 로지 마르때 제때 자치긴 잘랑강 할래와 그 중앙 요기 자카 첨부상 디그톤이 배톨 도낭치야 디그톤이 용 가르쳐는 그래서 자치긴 잘랑 나라 배때 자카나 있는다 자치긴 잘랑 배때 딱온다 재미 너바 나이체 나수체는 통야 고야 매바 조기를 동조 조토야 매바 템부터 퇴도와 덴득 나오지 퇴도 그래 디톤은 부터 간내간 퇴용도 템부터 퇴도와 대랑 가서 배배원신 대리 시선에 대원 자체 간다에 숙치를 가르다에 첨부 가르줘야이 도서 참마간 상로 만보치 해용 그래서 대중 댕이 그 만보시마 그래서 도단들 해들 뜨고는 대시 작을 해 참마 영망 영자 그래서 단에 투지 시설로 그렇지
All right, a very good morning to you all. Thank you very much for coming. First of all, the Tibet Policy Institute is very delighted to have Ambassador Dilip Sinha here, and also his wife, Madam Shri Sinha, also here. And Ambassador Ji is here to speak on his latest book, Imperial Games in Tibet, which was launched on 16 July. And we are happy to have him here to speak on this particular book. I think Ambassador Ji needs very little introduction. Director also has spoken about the book and about Ambassador himself in Tibet. Now, as a purpose for the journalist present here, please allow me to read a very brief introduction of Ambassador Ji. I thought the most accurate would be to read from the book itself, because there's a very, very brief and detailed introduction on Ambassador Yi. Dilip Sinha is a former diplomat, author, and public speaker. He served as the head of India's United Nations affairs during its Security Council membership and was the ambassador to UN in Geneva, where he was elected Vice President of the Human Rights Council and Vice Chairman of the South Center. Ambassador Sinha led India's response to the crisis in Libya and Syria. Within the Security Council and Sri Lanka in the Human Rights Council. That's important. In the course of his diplomatic career, he led India's relations with Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran, and held assignments in Germany, Egypt, Pakistan, Brazil, Bangladesh, and Greece. Now, besides this book, Ambassador also wrote a very popular book called Legitimacy of Power, The Permanence of Fire in the Security Council. Now, to your knowledge, Ambassador, we have here an invited group of audience. Because of the lack of space here in this particular library, we have limited it to 50 people. And most of the people who are here are people who are related to what you write. So we have members of parliament here, 2 members of parliament here. We have secretaries of Tibet administration, secretary of Department of Information and International Relations, secretary of finance. Then we also have honored to have a secretary from private office here, and then we have members of parliament, members of parliament, and also we have writers here. We have also researchers here, and we have also activists and advocates, and most importantly, we have both Indian and Tibetan journalists here to cover the event and also cover your book. Now, before Ambassador, you proceed with the talk, which you have time till 11, and then we'll have another 45 or so minutes of discussion, which I think will bring more very interesting discussion. But before you go into the book, after reading your biography, I thought, okay, how did Ambassador Ji got the spark to write a book on Tibet? So with that, please.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Director, for inviting me here, members of the Parliament, secretaries, and members of the Tibetan community here in Dharamshala. I am really grateful to the Tibetan Policy Institute for inviting me here to speak on this book. I'm delighted to come and speak here. This is a profound honor for me, and needless to say, it's a very daunting task as well, because I'm talking about Tibet to Tibetans. And I'm no expert on Tibet. I'm not an expert on China. I visited Tibet only once for about a week. I crossed across from Lipu Lake, Lipu Pass on this Kailash Mansarovar Yatra, and I went on a holy pilgrimage to Kailash Mansarovar. So the question that you asked me, what motivated me to write this book? Now, I've been a student of political science, of history, and obviously, as a diplomat, I represented India abroad, a long career. One of the things that I realized in the course of my career was that there was a considerable lacuna, a gap in the literature in India on India-China relations, because there was an undue focus on the border, and there was not enough understanding of what I think is the core issue between India and China, which is Tibet. So I wanted to write a book to make my own countrymen familiar with this issue, because even among my colleagues who were participants in international affairs like me, there was very little understanding of Tibet. Even in my own mind, I did not know much about the history of Tibet because I had not studied that in college or school. And one knew a little bit about China. But because we always looked at India-China relations as a border dispute, we never looked at Tibet, which is the large country between China and India. So I wanted to understand that. And that got me into reading about Tibetan history, about Chinese history, about Russia and Britain, of course, one knew because that is part of European history that one studies. But before I start talking about the book, let me make a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is that this book has not been sponsored by any institution, government or private. This is entirely the result of my individual effort. I did not talk to or consult any of the China experts, and we have many China experts in my former ministry, Ministry of External Affairs. Nor did I approach anybody, any of the Tibetans living in India, who are obviously very knowledgeable about Tibet, because I wanted to write it purely from the point of view of an Indian who has just studied the subject and what are the thoughts that came in his mind as he read through Tibetan history, Chinese history, and an understanding of international politics. So it was only after I finished the book, I had given it to the publisher, that I sent it to 4 people whose names figure in the cover of the book, of whom 2 are China experts, Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon and Mr. Vinod Khanna. One was a defense expert, Commodore Bhaskar, Uday Bhaskar, and one is a journalist, C. Raja Mohan. He's also a professor. So these are all people who are eminent in their own fields. So I sent the book to them, asked them for their comments, and I was extremely relieved, more than happy, I was relieved that they all endorsed the book. So which means there was no big bloomer in the book. Now the other, of course, was when the book reached the hands of people like you, who are both affected by the conflict, by the problems, and also who are original people of Tibet. So, how did you see the book? Was one of the other fears that I had in my mind. Have I made another mistake or something that I've offended? And I've been extremely glad to and relieved to find that the book has been well received. Now, as I said, I've been fairly candid, fairly frank, at times, in fact, ruthless in the way I've expressed my views in the book. So it is impossible not to offend somebody or the other. So I hope that you'll forgive me if I have said something that you think is not the most appropriate. Also, as I said, the book has not been sponsored by anybody, least of all by my former ministry. When the book was released, it suddenly became an important news, not because of the book, but because it coincided with the visit of the US congressional delegation to Dharamshala. So all of a sudden, there was this big thing that there was this book being released and there was this delegational visit. And people asked me whether there was any kind of link between the two. I said, look, when I started the book 5 years ago, I had no idea there'd be a congressional delegation coming and visiting Dharamshala on this particular month. But it was a very happy coincidence, which helped my book get a lot of publicity. And if people believe that there was some kind of connivance between me and the US, so be it. So as I said, I'm overjoyed at the reception the book has got and the interest it has created. And I'm very grateful to you for having invited me here. So let me turn to the book itself now. In the book, I have started by asking 2 questions. One is, why has China's claim to Tibet been accepted so easily by the whole world? Why has no country challenged that claim? And here, this is the primary focus of the book, because this is all about international politics, about the politics of the big powers. And that is something that I have lived through in my own career, having worked in the UN. One has seen how big powers negotiate on issues like climate change, on human rights, on when disputes take place, when wars take place. How do countries negotiate? How do they formulate their policies? And of course, I had to go through archival material to see what happened in the 19th century. And the second question is, which is also relevant here, is why has Tibet not been able to put forward its claim to statehood in a manner in which it becomes an item on the international agenda? Now, there are many disputes in the world which are on the international agenda. If you ask an international expert, is there likelihood of Second World War, Third World War breaking out? Where will it break out? Then they put all kinds of places, Palestine, South China Sea, this, that. When you talk about disputes in the world, international disputes, again, a lot of people mention a lot of places, but Tibet somehow does not figure in all that. Tibet figures at the most only in the Human Rights Council, where when human rights issues come up, then countries express their ideas and thoughts on human rights violations inside Tibet. But that does not take up the international aspect of Tibet. It is only about the human rights violations there. So I'll take up these two questions. Let me first take up the central theme of the book, which is when China invaded Tibet in 1950, it appealed to the United Kingdom, to the United States, to India, and to the United Nations for help. But none of them came to its help. And the UN Security Council, which is the organ of the UN charged with maintaining international peace and security, which should have taken up the matter, did not even take up the matter. The case was brought before the UN General Assembly by El Salvador. El Salvador is a country that nobody can place on the map, but it is there, and they brought it up. And after a very brief, perfunctory discussion in which there were 2 or 3 interventions, it was put in the cold storage. It was not dismissed. So the issue on the agenda that was taken up in the General Assembly technically is still there because it was never dropped formally. Now, even when the top leadership of Tibet fled to India 9 years later, along with thousands of other refugees, the world did not question the legitimacy of Chinese invasion. And this was despite the fact that at that time, it's very interesting to remember that the invasion of Tibet took place in October 1950. 4 months before that, in June 1950, North Korea had invaded South Korea. And North Korea was communist. It had the help of Russia and China, and it invaded South Korea. When it invaded South Korea, the Security Council met immediately, and it adopted a resolution authorizing military action by the UN in South Korea to defend South Korea. Now, the first question you'll ask is, why didn't the Soviet Union veto that resolution? It didn't veto it because the Soviet Union was boycotting the Security Council at that time. There was a period of about 6 or 8, 9 months when the Soviet Union in 1950 was boycotting the Security Council, or the UN itself, all UN meetings, because the Soviet Union wanted the People's Republic of China to take the place of the Republic of China in the UN. And since the US and the Western countries were not prepared to allow that, the Soviet Union got very angry and it decided to boycott the Security Council. And since it was boycotting it, the US moved the resolution in June 1950 and got the resolution adopted. And then the UN invasion, UN military action started. It was basically a US-led military action in which a number of other Western countries joined in, and they fought the North Korean army, and the rest is history, and you know all that. Now, the Soviet Union realized the mistake it had made, and after about, I think, 2 months or 3 months, it came back to the Security Council and then started vetoing. But by this time, the operation had already started. So I won't go into the details of all that happened at that time, but this was the history behind. So it is very ironic and interesting that just 4 months later, when in October 1950, China is also communist, invades Tibet, the world does not react. No country, a Western country, decides to take up the matter in a way in which it could be taken up the way South Korea, the Korean issue, became an international issue. So that was one. And then it was also ironic that India did not take up the matter, because India, by 1947-48, had formulated its foreign policy. And India's foreign policy had 2 main pillars in those days. One pillar was decolonization, that India was against all imperialism, and India was fighting for the independence of all the colonies of European powers. So India stood for the freedom. For example, India took an active interest in Indonesia's freedom struggle, and then for the freedom of other countries. But somehow, in the case of Tibet, it did not look upon it as a freedom issue. It looked upon it as in a geopolitical context of India-China relations, and how India and China could together work towards Asian solidarity against European imperialism. So in the perception of both the Western countries and India, there were other considerations that came into play rather than the issue of what happened to Tibet. Now, I come now to the Imperial Games itself. Now, we all know that the current configuration broadly of countries, in, at least in Asia, Africa, in fact, all over in Latin America also, in Americas also, the way countries have been formed, a lot, there's been a great deal of influence of the European imperial powers. Because they came in, they conquered, and then they started drawing boundaries. And most countries now have boundaries that were set by the imperial powers. Now, uh, in Asia, in Central Asia also, the same thing happened. Now, when I say Central Asia, I look at Tibet, East Turkestan, Xinjiang, Mongolia, and the 5 republics of the Central Asian republics. That is what I would look as Central Asia. So, in Central Asia, there were, we know about the Great Game between Russia and Britain, because in the middle of the 19th century, around 1840, 1850s, so, Russia was moving down south to conquer Central Asia, and Britain had just about reached the northern borders of India. Because Britain started conquering India in 1757 when the Battle of Plassey took place. And then it took Britain about 90 years to conquer all of India. And it annexed Punjab in 1847 or 1848. So when it annexed Punjab, Punjab was the kingdom of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and he had built a very powerful kingdom in Punjab, ruled from Lahore, and that kingdom included Jammu Kashmir, which included Ladakh. So when the British annexed the kingdom of Ranjit Singh, which is often called the Sikh kingdom, you can call it whatever name you want to give it, it was the kingdom built by Ranjit Singh. When they annexed Punjab, they also got Jammu and Kashmir, they got Ladakh as well. And then they started drawing the northern border of India, looking at what was happening. And in Jammu Kashmir and in Ladakh, Russia loomed very large. Because in 1840 or so, Britain had attacked Afghanistan because they were scared that Russia was going into Afghanistan. And when Britain attacked Kabul in 1839, it left its troops there, but within a year, the Afghans hit back and they butchered all the British living in Kabul. Now, this was a big, big blow to British prestige, to British psyche, that their people had been killed. Some people were taken hostage, and the British forces came back. Not, the forces didn't come back. There was only one person whom the Afghans spared, and that person came on a horse. And there's a very famous painting you can see on the website by a lady who made the painting of a British soldier coming back, so soldier or civilian coming back on a horse, very broken person. And the British had to take the help of some Indian businessmen in Delhi to pay money for ransom to get the kidnapped British citizens back. So the British got very scared that the Russians were coming in. And this is when the Great Game started, as the British tried to keep Russia away from India's borders. Tibet was slightly sheltered because it's a little further away from East Turkestan. So the main battle took place in East Turkestan or Xinjiang. Not battle, the main conflict, not main conflict, because there wasn't really a real conflict. It was just a game of shadows where the British troops would go in. They would, not so many troops, as surveyors. They would send surveyors, Russia would send surveyors. And that issue was taken up. And then Tibet came in slightly later as an issue in Russia-Britain relations. But then in this, you realize that the British and Russian game in Central Asia begins in the middle of the 19th century. But there was already an imperial power that had entered Central Asia 100 years earlier, and that was China, which was Qing China. The Qing dynasty was ruling, but the Qing were not Han Chinese. They were Manchus. The Manchus, as you know, they are people came from Manchuria. They were Buddhist. They were rivals of the Mongols. And when they conquered China in 1644, they took a long time to conquer the whole of China. They conquered China, and one of their main aims was to defeat the Mongols, because the Mongols were their old rivals, and the Mongols were a very powerful force in Dzungaria, in Mongolia, north of the Great Wall. So the Manchus were interested in conquering Central Asia to put the Mongols down, and they invaded Tibet, primarily because the Mongols were very powerful in Tibet at that time. And one of the reasons why the Kangxi emperor sent troops to Tibet was to get rid of the Mongols from there. And then he also realized that in Tibet there was a great deal of knowledge about Buddhism, about administration, about everything, which they could use. So the fifth Dalai Lama was invited by the Kangxi emperor to Beijing, and a palace was built in his honor. And he became an advisor to the Kangxi emperor, and this started the relationship between the Manchus and the Dalai Lama and other lamas in Tibet, which became the relationship. Now, again, I don't want to go into this because this is something that you already are familiar with. The Great Game starts, and China becomes a player in the Great Game because by the middle of the 19th century, the Qing dynasty had become very weak. Because in 1842, the first Opium War ended. In the first Opium War, Britain had defeated the Manchus and extracted Hong Kong from them and a lot of other trade concessions. Now, once the Manchus had been defeated by the British in the first Opium War, their authority in China became weak. And the Han Chinese in the south rebelled against Manchu rule. And this was called the Taiping Rebellion. And the civil war that started is considered to be one of the most brutal civil wars in history. And the Manchu dynasty was in deep trouble at this time. And just at this time, there was another incident in the seas called the Arrow incident, because of which Britain again invaded. This time it invaded northern China, and the British army reached Beijing and occupied Beijing. Lord Elgin was the commander of this army. So in 1860, the British army had reached Beijing. The Manchu emperor had fled to Manchuria, and he died there. He had left his brother behind as the regent. And the brother decided to patch up with the British and accept whatever conditions the British were putting. Now, it is interesting to note here that the British, when they conquered Beijing, they had the entire kingdom, entire empire at their disposal. But they did not annex China. They did not even overthrow the Manchu dynasty. Now, 3 years before that, in 1857, there was a revolt in India, where the Mughal emperor had led a revolt against the British. This was what's called the Sepoy Mutiny, or Indians call it the First War of Independence. And that was a big war that took place between Indians and the British. The revolt was crushed. The British sent the Mughal emperor to Rangoon as prisoner. The dynasty was abolished, and India was annexed in the British Empire. So the question arises, 3 years later, they have the Chinese empire at their disposal. Why didn't Britain annex China also? Why didn't it not overthrow the Manchu dynasty? And there was talk of that, of overthrowing the Manchu dynasty and taking over China also. Now, the answer to that lies again in the Great Game. Because when the British reached Beijing, this was the first time the British had entered Beijing. Because before that, they had tried to send an ambassador to Beijing. They had sent an ambassador had gone in 1793, I think. George McCartney was the ambassador who had gone to ask for trade concessions. But they had very little knowledge of that area. But the Russians had been present in Beijing for a long time. They had come there in the Ming period. And they also had a Russian Orthodox school, a religious school. They had an ambassador there. And when the British reached Beijing, and they had Beijing under their control, the Russian ambassador advised them that, look, very soon, winter will set in. When the winter sets in, the river will freeze. And the British had followed the river because they were basically a naval power. They had taken ships across the river to Beijing. The Russian ambassador said, once the river freezes, you'll be butchered by all these Mongols who will come down from the Tatars, they used to call. They didn't know the difference between Manchus and Mongols. They all called them Tatars. The Tatars were the Tatars will come down, and that will be the end of you. So Elgin withdrew immediately. He withdrew within 3 months of occupying Beijing because the Russian ambassador advised him, because he was scared that this may actually happen. So thereafter, the British decided that it was best not to annex China and to let the Manchu dynasty stay. And not only stay, but they were in deep trouble because there was this rebellion that hadn't been. So they decided to help the Tartars, as they called them. And now, how could they help them? Because the army was in disarray. So Britain changed its law, which prohibited a British subject or a British officer from serving a foreign king. That law was amended, and British army and navy officers were allowed to serve in the Manchu dynasty, in the Manchu government. And there was a very famous officer called Charles Gordon, who became so famous that he came to be called Chinese Gordon. He first set up what is called the ever victorious army, then the new army. He commanded that army. He fought on behalf of the Manchus against the Taiping rebels, who were basically Han Chinese. There was an American general who was also fighting along with the Chinese. There were French who were fighting. Then the British started helping the Chinese build their navy. And there was a person called Horatio Lay, who got ships ordered from England to be brought, and they trained Chinese officers in building up the navy. The insignia of the Chinese navy at that time was designed by this Horatio Lay. So you had the army and the navy being built by the British and the French. Some German help also came in. And this enabled the Manchu emperor, actually the emperor was still a child, because when the emperor had died, it was the uncle, Prince Gong, or Prince Kung, who was the main person liaising with the British. And they helped crush the rebellion. And then the question arose, what about the outskirts? So Xinjiang had rebelled, had declared independence. So the British persuaded the Chinese to reconquer Xinjiang, because if Xinjiang had not been recovered by the Chinese, then the Russians would have come in and taken Xinjiang. So now the Chinese didn't have enough money to build an army to go and attack and recover East Turkestan. So the British financed the army, and the general who was given command was a general who had been trained by the British, General Tso. And even when he was made governor of the Gansu province. When he moved there with his forces, there wasn't enough food. The Russians gave them food grains. Wheat was sent across to help them, and then they attacked and they recovered East Turkestan. And then, of course, they took over this whole area, and the British then started negotiating with China about the border between East Turkestan and Ladakh. Now, this was also the time when Tibet had become practically independent, because there was an Amban there. The Amban had never been thrown out. But in this period, when Nepal, for example, attacked Tibet, there was no Chinese army to come and protect the Tibetans. This was the time in 1841 when Zorawar Singh, a general of the Maharaja of Kashmir, he attacked and came to Taklakot. There was again no Chinese army to defend him. It was the Tibetan army that came and defeated him, and he was killed there. And there's also a mazar of his, or a samadhi, not a mazar, it's a samadhi in Taklakot. So this was the period when the Amban was there, but Tibet was for all practical purposes independent. So this is the story where you have British helping China recover. So although China calls this century from 1842, the end of the First Opium War, to 1949, when the Communist Party came to power, this is called the century of humiliation by China. And to a certain extent, it was a century of humiliation. The Europeans used to humiliate the Chinese. But the fact remains that the Europeans also helped the Chinese, which is why the American ambassador, Anson Burlingame, the American ambassador, he presented a book on international law to Prince Kung, who got it translated into Chinese and started using that book in his negotiations with Europeans. Then, when this ambassador retired, he was employed by the Chinese government and sent to Europe as the Chinese ambassador. And he went and traveled to a number of capitals in Europe. When China was negotiating with Russia, soon after conquering East Turkestan, there was one area called Kulja, which was, now it's called Yining or Ili. The Russians had not vacated that area, they had occupied that area. and Britain wanted that Russia be moved out of it. So China could not force Russia to withdraw. So the British put pressure upon Russia along with the French, and then they helped the Chinese negotiate to get the Russians out of that area. And again, I went to the archives to find out how the British helped the Chinese negotiate with the Russians. And when Russians threatened China, Chinese Gordon, who was that person that I mentioned, Chinese Gordon had by the time retired from China and come and he was working as one of the residents in one of the princely states in India. When Russia threatened China because of that war in Kulcha, he was immediately called back by the British, and he came back to China and started reorganizing Chinese forces. And the Russians then realized that they couldn't put pressure on China, so they accepted and they withdrew from that area. So these are all the games that took place in this period. And the century of humiliation was actually a century when there was a lot of cooperation taking place between Britain and China. Another point that I forgot to mention about the British help that came to China was that one of the things that Britain used to do, all European powers did, was that they would extract a lot of money from China. They used to impose penalty upon China and ask China to pay money. But China had no money. The coffers were empty. So they said, okay, you pay money from your customs duty. But the customs department itself was disorganized. So a British officer was appointed as the head of the customs office. In fact, he created the office, a person called Robert Hart. And Robert Hart built the customs office. He had British employees in the office. They would collect revenue, give part of it to the Chinese government and part of it to the British, Europeans, and others. And Robert Hart remained the head of the Chinese customs office till 1908. When he retired, another European became the head. The last head of the Chinese customs office was an American who fled along with Chiang Kai-shek in 1949 to Taiwan. So from 1862 or 63, when the office was first formed, till 1949, the customs office was headed by a European. And they were helping both the Chinese government and the Europeans because they could then extract money. So one of the historians wrote books I was reading that the Europeans would come to China, they would squeeze a little bit of money, then they found it was dying, so they said, okay, now revive it. Then squeeze again. So China became a kind of a goose that laid golden eggs. You had to keep the goose alive. If you killed the goose, then there was no golden egg. So this was a slight difference between the British conquest of India and the British conquest of China. So now I'll come to the last part of this part when Russia really started moving forward in in the early 20th century, and there were reports that Russia was sending arms to Tibet, and the 13th Dalai Lama had a debating partner or a guru or whatever called he was a Buryati Mongol called Dorjiev, and he was very friendly with him. Dorjiev went to visit St. Petersburg. This was just the early part of the 1900 or so. Now, the Britain became very excited about this, that Tibet is sending an ambassador to Russia, and they are conniving, and Russia will join hands with Tibet to invade India. So they followed Dorjiev's visit to St. Petersburg. They wrote about it. Russia, of course, kept protesting, saying that this is a purely religious visit. This has nothing to do with politics. But Dorjiev was there. And then there were reports that Russia was sending weapons to Tibet. And so this was the time when Lord Curzon was the viceroy in India. He persuaded Britain that Tibet should be attacked because there is a threat. So Francis' young husband, I believe Francis' young husband was born here in Dharamshala. He was a British army officer, also a great explorer. So Francis' young husband was called. He commanded the troops. They invaded Tibet. When the British forces reached Tibet, the 13th Dalai Lama fled to Mongolia. The young husband imposed a very harsh treaty on Tibet. Chumbi Valley would be annexed. 75 million rupees was the penalty imposed. And during this time, Britain's, if you read the correspondence, we in India look at only young husband and what happened to Tibet and what happened. But the main politics was taking place between Britain and Russia. There's a lot of correspondence taking place between the British ambassador in St. Petersburg and the Russian government. The Russian government was protesting to Britain, saying you are not supposed to attack Tibet because Tibet is not part of the British Empire and Tibet is a part of China. So Britain also realized that if they tried to stay on in Tibet for any length of time, then the Russians might seriously get interested in invading Tibet. So they kept explaining to Russia that, look, our interest in Tibet is purely commercial. Britain had signed a treaty with China in 1890, allowing free export of Indian tea into Tibet. Now, Tibet refused to accept that provision. So Britain said that, look, we are only trying to enforce that trade treaty on Tibet. We have no desire to occupy Tibet. So because of Russian pressure, Britain immediately withdrew its troops from Tibet. Of course, it kept occupying Chumbi Valley, but then it immediately invited a Chinese representative to come from China to Calcutta for talks, because they wanted to ensure and reassure Russia that Tibet was a part of the Chinese Empire and Britain had no desire to annex it. So the Chinese representative came, and he came in 1905, just 1 year after. And a new treaty was signed by Britain with China. The first treaty was in 1890, then a treaty in 1906. The 1906 treaty is the first treaty in which Britain explicitly recognized Chinese suzerainty over Tibet. And it decided that it would reduce the penalty imposed on Tibet from 75 million to 25 billion rupees. And in fact, China agreed to pay that money. And they said that as soon as the money is paid, we will withdraw the British forces from Chumbi Valley. And then Britain went to Russia and said that now let us settle the border between British Empire and Russian Empire on how to divide Central Asia. And 1 year later, in 1907, the Anglo-Russian Treaty was signed. It's called the Anglo-Russian Treaty on Persia, Afghanistan, and Tibet. So the border between the two empires was drawn, not just a border, it was also a broad sphere of influence also. So in this agreement, it was decided that Tibet would be part of the Chinese Empire, but Britain would have some commercial interest there, so they could keep some trade offices in 3 places, Gyatse, Gartok, and Shigatse. In 3 places, they could have trade representatives, but no representative in Lhasa. That was prohibited to Britain. Britain could not keep open a mission in Lhasa, and Russians insisted on that. So, and then Afghanistan came into the British sphere of influence, and Iran, there was Persia was a separate, I won't go into that. So this brought to an end the great game between Britain and Russia. But soon after that, major developments took place, as you know. One was in China in 1912, the Manchu dynasty collapsed. In Russia in 1917, the Russian Revolution took place and the Romanov dynasty collapsed. Britain, of course, survived, but the First World War broke out, and Britain became slowly a much weaker power, and it couldn't play much of a role in this area. But nevertheless, Britain still realized that it needed to get Tibet status settled, and the India-China or India-Tibet border also settled. And this happened especially after the collapse of the Manchu dynasty. There was again a civil war in China. And there were 2 governments in China, one in the south by Sun Yat-sen and one in the north by Yuan Shikai. America recognized the government of Sun Yat-sen. Britain recognized the government of Yuan Shikai. And in 1913, they invited, oh yes, but I forgot one major development in this period, that immediately after the collapse of the, I'll go back a little further. 1906, the treaty between Britain and China on Tibet status, suzerainty of suzerainty. The 13th Dalai Lama was not present in Lhasa. He had already migrated to Mongolia. The British were putting pressure upon China and Russia to ensure that the Dalai Lama did not come back to Tibet, because the British were very suspicious of him, that he would come back and start playing his politics all over again. So they insisted that Dalai Lama should not be allowed to come back. But Dalai Lama went first to Beijing, where he met the Chinese emperor. They were both dying, the emperor and the Shi, who was the dowager. So he finally gave up over there and he came back to Lhasa. But when he came to Lhasa, around the same time, this person called Chow Er-feng. Chow Er-feng was the Chinese governor. He was a Han Chinese. He was the governor of the province on the border. It was called the Marshes or Shikang, I think he called it. It's the broad area of Amdo and Sichuan area. And he was also simultaneously appointed as Amban to Lhasa. So immediately after the return of the Dalai Lama to Lhasa, he invaded Lhasa. And the Dalai Lama fled again. And this time he fled to India. And he was in India until the Manchu dynasty collapsed. When the Manchu dynasty collapsed, there was a revolt even among Chinese soldiers against Chow Er-feng. Chow Er-feng was killed. And the Chinese army was then surrounded by Tibetan forces. And they surrendered their weapons. And the Dalai Lama decided to go back to Lhasa. And in 1913, he declared independence. The Chinese army that was stranded there had to go back to China, but it was too risky to go back by land. So the British helped the Chinese army to go back via India. And by this time, the route to Lhasa became more through Hong Kong and Calcutta, through India, rather than through the more difficult route that was there earlier between Lhasa and the northern route and the eastern route. So this was the time when he declared independence in Tibet. Britain decided that it was very important to get Chinese suzerainty again enforced on Tibet. And again, Britain invited a representative from Lhasa, Shatra, Longchen Shatra, is it right? Paljor, yes, Paljor. A Chinese representative, Ivan Chen, and they came to India. They had long talks from October till July, 1913 to 1914, partly in Shimla, then in Delhi, then again back in Shimla. And you all know about that period. But the important thing is that we have always looked at the Shimla Agreement as an agreement that determined the border between the McMahon line and the disputed border between Tibet and China. But the real purpose, to my mind, was to ensure that Tibet did not break away from the Chinese Empire. Which is why even in the agreement that was the three-party agreement that was only initialed by Ivan Chen and never ratified by China. In that again, it's mentioned that Tibet is a part of China. So Chinese sovereignty is recognized even in that agreement. So it was a very strange agreement in which Britain recognized that Tibet was a part of China and yet had Tibet participate in it as an equal player. So this is one of the imperial games again where you have powers playing these games, which would be impossible today. You can't have a province of a country going and signing an agreement with an international agreement. But this was the ambiguity about the Tibet status in this period. And that continued later. Yuan Shikai, of course, died, and later on when China invaded, that same kind of ambiguity prevailed. So I'll cut across all this and jump straight to the second question, which is why is it that Tibet has not been able to register its claim to statehood as an international issue? And here, one of the things is that Tibet's claim has always been expressed partly been expressed in religious language, the Choyon relationship. Or even here today, I hear that with India, it is a Guru-Shishya relationship. Now, these are religious terms, and they have no standing in international relations. So they cannot become part of any international construct of statehood. And in modern times, there was one very strong political expression of independence, that was by the 13th Dalai Lama in 1913. But as I said, after that, the Shimla Agreement came, and then there was the First World War, and the Second World War, and a huge amount of changes taking place in the world, as a result of which that declaration got lost in history. And it is rarely remembered. And then when China attacked Tibet in 1950, Tibet itself signed the agreement with China in 1951. And then in 1954, India signed the Panchsheel agreement with China. So all these agreements put together somehow created a generally widespread impression that Tibet is a part of China, and therefore whatever discussion takes place internationally is not on the status of Tibet any longer as essentially its position within China, and other issues like human rights, which are, of course, global issues. So, while Tibet has not been able to put forward its claim to statehood forcefully enough, China has been putting forward its claim very, very forcefully, and that we know. And one of the points that I've studied in the book is how does the country become sovereign? Now, this again becomes an issue that I found in the discussions when the President Dalai Lama, His Holiness, came to India in 1956, and then again in 1959 when he came as a refugee, took asylum. There was this issue of sovereignty. And one of the questions asked in the discussions with, not with the Prime Minister Nehru, but with the Foreign Secretary, was when does sovereignty end? When does suzerainty end? Because India took the stand that Tibet is under the suzerainty of China. And the question came up, what is the difference between suzerainty and sovereignty? And then when does sovereignty end? Does it end at all? And these were questions that were not answered in the discussions that took place. And so I've examined that question. I said, what makes a country sovereign internationally? And I found that there is no clear answer to this. There are countries that are regarded as sovereign when they are not really truly sovereign. And there are countries that are sovereign, but they compromise their sovereignty at some various points. For example, I have given some examples to that. But eventually, it's a question of how effectively and how forcefully a country claims sovereignty. So, for example, one example I can give you is that East Germany and West Germany, after the Second World War, were occupied by foreign forces, by Britain, Russia, Italy, and the US. Not Italy, France, Britain, and US in the western part, and Russia in the eastern part. So they were still under occupation, and they had very little control over their defense and even over their foreign policy, and yet both of them became members of the UN. North Korea and South Korea, both are members of the UN, and yet they have foreign forces on their soil. So today, countries are members of the European Union, where a lot of their foreign policy is coordinated in Brussels. Are they sovereign? Are they not sovereign? So these are debates that can take place among academicians, but the fact remains that because these countries claim to be sovereign, therefore they are sovereign. So sovereignty is a lot about who claims what. And here, China's claim is always louder and very assertive, whereas Tibet's claim has not been. In fact, when the Chinese asked when did Tibet become a part of China, then another thing I found out was, of course, this I got from secondary sources because I don't have access to Chinese original sources, but experts, Western experts on China who have written about China, say that Elliot Sperling, for example, who's written a book, he said that the idea that Tibet became a part of China in the Manchu period, in the 18th century, is a very new idea. It was only in the early 20th century that Chinese historians started saying that Tibet became a part of China in the 18th century. Then, recently I was listening to this person called Victor Gao, who works for a think tank in China. He said, this was very recently, about maybe 2 or 3 months back or something, he said, since the Yuan dynasty, Tibet has been a part of China, which is the Mongols. Now, we all know the Mongols are not Chinese, and Kublai Khan was the grandson of Genghis Khan. But he said Yuan dynasty. Now, Victor Gao is, of course, a very knowledgeable person in China. But now the Chinese government says Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. Now, what are ancient times? We don't know, but now they have pushed the date back to ancient times. So Chinese historians themselves are unclear when exactly did Tibet become a part of China. And there's a dispute about that, starting from ancient times to Mongol times to Manchu times. And in my opinion, even when the Amban was there under Manchu rule, you must remember the Amban under the Manchus was always a Manchu, was never a Han Chinese. And it was the first Han Chinese, I don't know when the first Han Chinese became an Amban. Certainly Chao Er-feng was a Han Chinese, and he was appointed Amban in 1910. So the actual effective Chinese rule over Lhasa begins only after 1906. When the Dalai Lama was not there was a vacuum, and the British were encouraging the Chinese to come in and take over, so that at least formally Tibet would remain a part of the Chinese empire, so as not to create a vacuum for. Now, a vacuum is another concept that was interesting. See, normally we think that an independent country is a sovereign country, therefore it can be a buffer. But in the old imperial thinking, so even in India, for some people think that Tibet was always a buffer between China and India. But in the imperial thinking of those days, a small independent country was a risk, because imperial powers could go and occupy a small country. So if Tibet had been, let's say, an independent country, then Britain would be scared that Russia would come and occupy it, or Russia would be scared that Britain would go and occupy it. So they felt that another empire should have control over Tibet, and that was the Chinese empire. So in this imperial thinking, a small country could not be independent. This is a very new concept. It's only in the modern times that we think that a small country can also remain independent, because you have the United Nations, which can at times work. But in those days it was not. So I think I'm coming to the end of my point. So I'll now come to the last part of my 2 points. One is India's policy. I'll just skip over because I've already mentioned India's policy on what and why India adopted the policy that it did. Then I come to the modern times, and there are two ironical things that one has to keep in mind, two ironies of history, and that is that in the great game that was played out in Central Asia, those countries that were assigned to the Russian Empire or to the British Empire, they became independent. Eventually, the British Empire collapsed after the Second World War, and the Soviet Empire collapsed in 1990. But those that were assigned to China continued to remain the Chinese Empire, because the Communist Party asserted claim over all those territories that the Manchus had ruled over. So this is one of the ironies. And the other irony is that in 1945, after the Second World War, when the UN was formed in October 1945, at that time, almost all of Africa and most of Asia was under European rule. But Tibet was not. Tibet was independent at that time. Now, in the last 60 years or so, actually by 1990 itself, and the 40 years or so, over 100 countries became independent, and they became members of the UN. But in this period, Tibet lost its independence. So you have another irony that has taken place. Now, internationally, as I said, there was this great game that led to whatever happened. Today's geopolitical situation is also such that, in a way, the great game with different players in different format is coming back. Because now you have China has become a superpower, and the US looks at China as a rival, as a competitor, and therefore is trying to build alliances against China. And the US sees Tibet as a soft underbelly of China. So it's interested in it. So you have Tibet coming back into the international arena as a playground. It also becomes an opportunity, but it's also a major problem as to how to deal with this situation. So I'll stop here. I think it's 11, so thank you for this patient listening.
We come to the conclusion of a very, very interesting talk from Ambassador Dilip Sinha and a very frank and lively discussion from the audience. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Before we end, please allow me to share another anecdote. I think that would be interesting here with the topic, of course, relevant to the topic. So it was the Tibet Times brought out an interview to an elderly Tibetan woman, and whose story goes like this. The elderly Tibetan grandma, she left eastern part of Tibet, went to Lhasa. They were traders, and from Lhasa they went to India. So it was in 1952, somewhere 1952. And they came into India through Rinpoche, and then they visited most of the Buddhist pilgrimage sites in India. And it took 2 years for them. So it was pilgrimage come business, traders. So what I'm trying to show here is, when they left, there was this free border free movement of people between the two nations, as existed since the 7th century. When the Indian masters traveled to Tibet, Tibetan masters traveled to India. But after traveling in India for 2 years, and in 1954, after visiting Bodh Gaya, where His Holiness was also there at that time because of the Bodh Gaya celebration.
56.
56, yes.
56, yeah.
So after 1956, when the group, after the having a glimpse of His Holiness, they started to move back to Tibet, because that was the intention, right? It was a trade pilgrimage. So as they went back through the same route they came in, and they went through, again through Mount Karambuche. And suddenly they were stopped by Chinese military personnel who were not there when they left that part of the area. And there was an argument between the Tibetans and the Chinese military personnel. And the Chinese military personnel asked them, "Where's the paper to go back to Tibet?" He says, "Who are you to ask us where's the paper? We are going back to our home."
Yeah.
But somehow they could not go back.
Oh.
Somehow they could not go back because 1956, when they went back, the border was, Chinese personnel were already on the borders, who were not there when they left. So what happened? They had come back. Some of them settled around Ladakh, and the grandma, we call her Ramse Ama, she used to be in almost all Sujitian protests. So what I'm trying to say here is, within 6 or 7 years after that, India had the first war with China, which was otherwise impossible because there was never a border between India and China. So the issue of Tibet is important for Tibet, for sure, no doubt about that. But the issue of Tibet is also very, very important for India in many ways. That I think also there's a realization among researchers, thinkers, politicians. So this is what I want to say. But most importantly, we are very happy with the book. We are very grateful that you brought out this book, and I'm sure you already could see a lot of them have the books around here. So Tibet Policy Institute want to thank you for this, and we hope to have more and more collaborations in the coming days and months. And with that, if you have any
just two words.
Yes,
Two words. One is that the cover of this book was picked by Macmillan. It is a photograph that was there of a Tibetan woman in Nepal, and they have taken that as the and this was a lady, a designer from Macmillan who's chosen that. That's been, I suppose, been very popular, and many people have appreciated the cover. The other point that I make very often among Indians, I say that 62 war is there on our psyche as a major defeat that we suffered. And I said that we look at the 62 war as a border dispute. I said, look at the sequence of events. In 1959, we gave shelter to His Holiness. That was the time when China decided to give us a big slap on our face. So the war was not to, China did not invade India to capture Indian territory. They had already taken whatever they wanted in Naksai Chin and a few other areas. They invaded India to give a slap on our face. They did that and they went back. So we have to understand that there is a bigger game going on, and it's not a border dispute of one hill here and one hill there that is at stake over here. There is a bigger issue at stake. That is what our people have to understand. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with this, I ask our Director Umadaw Sinha to offer Kada and
아주 내용
Madam.
Thank you.